Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second panel of the day, following Cari and Jane's conversation this morning. And we have a fabulous panel today on researching the details and getting the facts right. We're going to see how writers do that. So I'm going to give you a bit about them in case you weren't with us yesterday. And we've got Barbara Ann Wright joining us very, very early from the States. And she's got some great stuff to say too. So I'm going to start with Barbara. Barbara Ann Wright writes fantasy and science fiction novels starring sarcastic lesbians. She's won 5 Rainbow Awards, but who's counting? Her newest book, Lady of Stone, will be out in September. So welcome to Barbara.
Thank you very much.
Next, we've got M.A. Binfield, who is a hopeless romantic living in the UK. She published her first book, One Small Step, in 2019. And has 2 more in the pipeline, including Not This Time, due for release later this year. Michelle loves reading, tea, writing, tea, theater, tea, and traveling. She's 6'2", but no, she doesn't play basketball. Thanks for asking. Cari Hunter, little wave, Cari, hi. Lives in the northwest of England with her wife, their cat, and a field full of sheep. She's been a paramedic for 18 years and dreams up stories in her spare time. She has 8 novels under her belt, including the Dark Peak crime series, and is currently working on her 9th. And Cari's got some fabulous tales about sheep. If you ever want to send her a message and just say, tell me a sheep tale, she can do that. Next up, we have Justine Saracen. Give a little wave, Justine. Hello. Is one of the Bold Strokes old hands who's been putting out lesbian historical novels for over a decade. She's written about the Egyptians, the crucifixion, the Crusades, Michelangelo's Rome, Venice, and the Inquisition. But her last half dozen have been about World War II. Hitler's stormtroopers, Stalin's Red Army, GIs, RAF, the French resistance, female Soviet pilots, and lesbians. Because you can make both love and war. Nice. Her latest is To Sleep with Reindeer, a war resistance while struggling for survival in the Norwegian tundra novel. Living with the reindeer and fighting Nazis, and passion under the Northern Lights. Excellent. And last but not least, we have Rebecca S. Puck. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
Born in Nottingham, England, Rebecca's life has taken a few twists and turns, including a spell working as a private tutor in eastern Slovenia. But now she is back in her homeland again, and working in the education sector of the museum and heritage industry. So welcome to our fabulous panelists. Good morning, or afternoon, I suppose. So, what's the most exciting part of research? Let's start there. Barbara, let's start with you. What's the most exciting part of research for you?
Well, I think that's the most exciting part for the book, and then there's the most exciting part for me, the author. The most exciting part for the book, I think, is when you're researching something and you really hit on something that's going to make your world bigger and brighter. Something that's really going to be like something that's really going to resonate for readers. The most exciting part for me, I think, is when I stumble on some incredibly interesting fact that has nothing to do with anything and leads me down a rabbit hole where I learn something that I never thought I would ever know. Like, sometimes a polar bear can meet a grizzly bear when the moon is right, and you get a grizzly bear. Or something like that, and I learned something that no one ever wanted to know, but that I can carry around forever and trot out at parties or panels like this one.
A grizzly bear. Mm-hmm. I want a grizzly bear.
It's a grizzly bear, a growler bear. It's called these 2 things. It's very, very rare. Some people doubt it even exists at all. But it said it's a half grizzly, half polar bear hybrid. Conditions have to be very special for this to happen.
I like it. That's just what a way to start the panel. Justine, what's the most exciting part of research for you?
When I can manage it, which is only about half the time, it's going there. Most of my recent novels have been about World War II, and which largely took place in Europe. The European theater did. So I try to go to the locations that I'm talking about. And that's very enlightening because I always only have a superficial knowledge of what happened, but going to the beaches at Normandy and going to the places, going to the concentration camps, going to the places where people hid. It's sobering, it's enlightening, it's exciting. And then you've got to come home and do the actual work.
Mm. And do you find that those images stay with you as you're writing? Because I travel for mine as well, and I know they really stick with me as I write.
They do, and of course the task, my task, is to transfer that profound emotional reaction that I've had to the page, because I want my reader to have it too.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
yes, of course, and it stays with me long after the book is moved on down the line. I think my life has been enormously enriched by each novel simply because I put myself in a new place.
Nice, very nice. Rebecca, how about for you?
It's interesting because I think I'm always researching something. So my job's working in museums, and I'm studying for a master's degree at the moment. So the kind of research just feels like a constant thread in my life. The exciting thing for doing it for a book is that combination of the research and the real facts and the creative story you want to put in there, and finding the way to weave them together. And sometimes it can be a really happy accident that you've got an idea of something you want to write, and then you find the fact or the situation or the context that just seems so perfect for that. And it's a really interesting thing of whether the research comes first and that gives birth to the story, or whether you've got the story you want to write and then you find a way of working that into the research. And I mean, I would say that most of my historical novels have been a little bit of both, but it's a really interesting process to go through. And yeah, just the way it can sometimes, the research can actually bring the story you want to life because it gives you those layers that maybe you didn't know about before. So that's really fun.
Nice. Multi-layered is always nice. How about you, Emma Binfield?
Yeah, I think a little bit of that for me, a little bit of all of it, I suppose. I think what I really like, maybe it makes me sound a little bit nerdy, but I really like it when you want something to happen in your book. Like you have this idea. I had an idea my characters would run up Parliament Hill on Hampstead Heath and sit on a bench at the top and have some tense, emotional love scene. And then I didn't know if that was 20 miles or 5 miles, or would they have to be an Olympic athlete to make it up there. So then you just do a little bit of research and you realise it will work. It works. It is possible. And so just little things like that. I get a lot of satisfaction from just finding out that ideas you have, you can actually make them work in a book and no one's going to think it's completely wrong. And I quite like the idea of visiting places that you write about. The book that is out in December is set in Miami, so I'm going to take Justine at her word and go and have a nice holiday. And I'm doing research. It's a great idea.
Yeah, I think it's always a good excuse. Oh, I'm doing research.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
Research.
Yeah, that was my last excuse for going to Venice for the third time. Cari, most exciting thing about research for you?
Exciting thing, but it's certainly the most interesting thing for me is looking at the gory stuff. So a lot of my stuff has kind of the criminal kind of element to it. So I'm looking at bad people doing bad things and what those bad things do to a body a lot of the time. So I'll be researching like how relevant rigor mortis is, in terms of timing death and putting an accurate kind of time of death on a body, or what a bullet does to the body as it goes through. So a lot of it's like kind of really grim Google imaging and like I said yesterday, things that would probably get me on a few watch lists if my internet history was ever investigated. But I don't want to get things wrong, so I get kind of tired of reading people getting shot, and there's a line in Alias that I just threw in there just to take the piss a little bit, because people are always getting shot in the shoulder on television, and all they get is, I think the line is, all they get is a sling and some sympathy. A bullet does a hell of a lot of damage, so I had Price be quite badly messed up when she gets shot in the shoulder, just to redress the balance a little bit. But it tears through muscle, it goes through arteries, it hits nerves. She ends up with nerve damage to one of her fingers, and that's just me. Just people know that when a bullet hits you, it hurts, sort of thing.
The romance.
I love that kind of thing.
Yeah. I've just come over all faint. I'm a romance writer. Don't talk to me about sinews and bullets and things.
But it's true, though, isn't it? When you are aware of research and the things that go into these things, and you watch something on telly or you read something in a book and you think, Why did you just throw that in without any, I was watching something the other day, Cari, where somebody got shot in the shoulder, and they were running around punching people. And I thought, I'm pretty sure it would hurt more than that.
Yeah. It'd break bones and, like I say, smash blood vessels, and you wouldn't be using that arm for a while. You certainly wouldn't be hitting anybody with it.
Yeah.
My wife has actually banned me from watching anything kind of medical drama on telly, because all I do is scream at the telly, well, that oxygen's not going to work if you don't switch it on. That kind of thing. I can't do it anymore. I am actually barred.
That's awesome. Okay, so when you're starting out on a new project and you know it's going to require research, do you generally start on the basis of what you already know, or do you allow yourself to start kind of at zero and then just work yourself into the knowledge? Justine, let's start with you on that one.
That's a tough one. It's kind of a mishmash of all of those things. I usually decide on one of the major events of World War II, which puts it in a country, in a context. But then I think, what scenes do I especially think would be good to write about, that my readers would react to? So then I have to fit the history to the scenes that I want to portray. But then I have to be as authentic as possible, because I never want to lie. I have to lie a lot, but I don't like to. For example, in Sleeping with Reindeer, I talk about all these wonderful events that were done by Norwegian resistance fighters, but they were all men. But that doesn't do me any good, so I had to put a couple of women in there. So, I do lie, but what was the question?
I love it.
Yeah, I do both. I start with a very fundamental idea, and then I try to make the history work around it.
Awesome, cool. Now, Barbara, you write primarily kind of sci-fi and fantasy, right? Like I do. So
Yes.
How do you approach your research with a new book?
Well, I'm always starting from scratch, because I much prefer making up my own world than living in the real one, just like every day. So I have to just say, I come up with my characters, my plot, my this kind of thing, and then I just sort of build the world around them. And it's cool because I get to make up everything. So if I don't like a thing, I can just change the thing. But it sucks because I have to make up everything. So I'm like, okay, well, what kind of a biome do I want? Is it a forest? Is it a mountain? Is it an ocean? And then I can make up the creatures that go in it, but they have to make sense. So I'm like, okay, well, it's a forest, so I really can't have this thing living in it that would actually be more suited to a desert or something, because then it feels wrong to me, so I know it would feel wrong to the reader.
Nice. Yeah, cool. How about you, Rebecca?
I'd say that I always start with a point from something I know, because I tend to write historical. I always start in a place where it's something I'm interested in, but the extent to which I'm familiar with it might vary. So when I wrote Truths, which was my first novel, I hardly did any research at all, because it was all about the history that I worked with in my day-to-day life in the museum I was working in at the time. So I had it all there, and I just wanted to put a story into that. As we've kind of gone on, I've been more inspired by an idea, sort of a little bit like Justine said. There's a moment that you want to capture, an event you want to capture, and then you then start to kind of embroider that from there with the research and things, and start to discover more about it. So it's a little bit of both, but I always start in a place of having some knowledge of where I'm going. Otherwise, I think I'm just a bit frightened that I'll either get really bored, because it will turn out to be something I'm not that interested in, and once you start putting in the research for a project, you feel like you want to follow it through, or that you're not quite sure it'll have the capacity to deliver the story you want it to deliver as well. So I like to know a bit about particularly historical situations before I start.
Nice. Cool. Excellent. How about you, Emma?
I think it's I write contemporary lesbian romance, so it's sort of I get away with the research to an extent. It's very contemporary and it's in this world, so I'm not having to create a world. Or I admire people that write fantasy and things like that so much. Actually, I just couldn't do it. But I think for me it starts with characters always, and then those characters develop and suggest things to you that sometimes you wish they wouldn't, and then you have to research that kind of thing. I had a character in One Small Step, Iris, just wanted to be a poet. Like I tried to fight it off. I don't know anything about poetry. I've never written poetry. I've never been to a poetry slam, and I just could not get rid of it as a sort of feature of her as a character. And in the end, I just had to embrace it and go to a poetry slam and figure out how that works and watch how it works. I even wrote a bit of poetry. I think one stanza ended up in the books. I cut some of it out, but I left some of it in. So I haven't done that since I was at school. So it was kind of very character based, and then as they need things or want things or situations develop, then I do research to make it make sense rather than the other way around. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Excellent. And Cari, do you start from kind of a place you know, or do you start at zero and then work yourself into a new book?
I usually start from a place I know, just because of my job. Most of my books have been set around the medical / crime kind of genre, so it's easy for me to find a hook that I can work with and then research from there. So I know from like the Dark Peak books, they're going to be a crime series, so I know that I'm going to be working police procedural kind of details, so that's my research bent. I know that Meg's a doctor, so I will do the research as to any conditions that she might encounter. Similar with that, I mean, Breathe was my easiest book. I don't think I did much research with that at all, because it was the only one that I've written that was based paramedic-y. So I kind of had that background and I knew what I was doing with that. A lot of the medical details I have to look into quite a lot, because the characters are above my grade, basically. They're mostly doctors. I've only written one paramedic, and she came in book 8 by the time I finally did write a paramedic featured story. So yeah, someone like Meg's a doctor, so she will do things that I can't do. She will give drugs that I can't give. So, and I always want to get those details right. Obviously, I don't want somebody to come back to me and slap my wrists and say, actually, you made a right balls up of all that medical stuff. How could you do that? You're a paramedic. So those are the bits and pieces that I absolutely want to get spot on. So I'll put the legwork in for those.
So kind of going along those lines then, and I'm just going to remind everybody, put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom. We might miss them in the chat, so if you put them in the Q&A, we'll definitely see them. So I want to talk about believability, because obviously you're writing, so we've got historical, and we've got romance, and we've got kind of thriller types, and then we've got fantasy and sci-fi. So we're kind of across the board here. But I think everybody's touched on it a little bit, is believability. So when you're doing your research, have you come across anything that you think that's true, but it wouldn't be believable in what I'm writing? Like, people wouldn't actually think, oh yeah, that's true. Because there's that thing, isn't there, about truth being stranger than fiction. So how do you go about kind of making your world believable and balancing that against the research you've done and the facts that you've got? Rebecca.
Hard question. I'm not sure I've ever come across anything that I think people wouldn't believe. I think that the nature, I tend to write a lot of sort of social history type context. So it tends to be the ordinary rather than the extraordinary that I'm researching. So a lot of the time, so for Fragile Wings, I wanted my characters to go and have afternoon tea at a posh hotel in Mayfair. So my research was what kind of tiles would have been on the floor, what would it have looked like? So, I don't always come across those sort of extraordinary details, but I think it is actually in those small details that makes it believable. And I don't mean that I'm going to write kind of really sort of gothic descriptions of everything in the room, but if you've got in your head that really clear picture, if you've looked at a photograph of the place or you've been to the place, I think you can just throw in enough small details that you create a believable world. And then if something comes along that maybe people don't think is quite right for the historical context because they didn't think that was happening then, or they or would be surprised that your characters would encounter a certain thing or something like that, because the background is so authentic, it fits. And so, yeah, but I mean, I would avoid anything that kind of jolted people out of it. Even if I thought it was really fascinating, I wouldn't necessarily include it if I thought it was going to make people think that I wasn't telling a truthful story.
Nice. So kind of for you, it's the devil's in the details. Yeah, cool. Awesome. Justine, how do you balance kind of the research details that you put in?
Oh,
to
yes,
make it
yes.
believable?
Because I was reading the questions on the side, and they're quite different. As a historical writer, I have a very strong obligation to be authentic, to be convincing, because first of all, of course, I want to write an interesting story. I want someone to read my book and say, "Wow, I really like that book." But also, I don't want them to learn the wrong things. I don't want them to I want to correct the false ideas that they probably already have. So I don't want to introduce more false ideas. So I stay as close as I can to the historical details, to the facts of the matter. So I do a lot of research on that. Really, the only time I actually lie is when I need to talk about the women in my story. When I wrote about the Witch of Stalingrad, the female Soviet pilots and the female snipers, I didn't have to lie at all because they were there, and I could tell almost scene for scene things that actually happened. But with the last one, the events in Norway, I had to lie about the women. But I would say that I try very, very hard to be faithful to the historical details, mainly putting in details that I'm certain that my reader doesn't yet know.
And Barbara, how about you? Because obviously you get to make everything up, but you still have to be true to what you built, don't you?
Right. Well, I think I come up against believability more in sci-fi than I do in fantasy, except for the whole getting stabbed in the shoulder thing, which fantasy writers have to deal with too, but most of us just brush off. And that's not how arteries work in my world.
Yeah,
anyway,
it's magic.
Yes. In science fiction, if you read science fiction or you watch science fiction on TV, most of it is very, very interesting, but very unrealistic. Stuff in space is a long way away from each other, and getting somewhere in space would take a very, 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 very long time. So you have to kind of have to find a way to deal with that in books to tread the line between believable and boring, especially when it comes to, like, if you're having, two planets at war, there's really, if you're far enough in the future to have spaceships that make, like, interstellar travel possible, people like landing on the ground and running and shooting and fighting shooting guns and fighting and yelling at each other. It's like, no, that kind of thing would be done with robotics. It just be, but it's a lot more interesting to have people trying to get along face to face than to have, like, somebody in a room drinking coffee on a computer, killing lots of people with the touch of a button, sort of thing, or just sort of, it's in books you can kind of get more realistic stuff, but it definitely, if you're watching shows and things, they just kind of cut all that out. So it's really just like, all right, how long is someone going to sit and read about, they're still in space, day 900, they're still in space, day 1500. It's just, so you just sort of like, yep, suddenly they're there.
Which is the benefit of making shit up. Yeah, excellent. May, how about you?
I mean, I think believability in a love story. I write love stories between people who we want to fall in love and end up together, but not too quickly, because the book would be really short. So I think believability is just, it's all around us, isn't it? We're all vulnerable when we're in love. We're all a bit perverse sometimes, and we don't always say what we think, and we dissemble, and we're vulnerable. Sometimes we're happy, sometimes we're sad. So I think believability in a love story is just about the sort of human character and making sure that people are behaving like humans. We are complex and contradictory, so just getting that right, I think. I've read some great romances. I'm not a tennis player, but I've read great romances about that. I've never felt like, I'm sure the author wasn't a tennis player either. I'm not a girl band singer, surprisingly. I can write about that because of that universal condition of how we are when we're in love. So I think for me, believability is just, are the characters doing things that you would do or people around you would do when they're in love? and does that feel believable? And if they are, we had a discussion at a panel yesterday about this notion that people don't talk, and if they talked, love stories would be a lot shorter because people would get together a lot sooner. But I think, from my experience and the experience of my friends, people don't always talk when they're in love or worried and they're vulnerable and insecure. So, yeah, I think that makes it believable. We all know that feeling, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Cari?
I don't think I've ever encountered anything in research that's been too extraordinary to put into a novel. But I do find myself sort of censoring myself at times because some of the stuff I find might be too gory or upsetting. So I think that's, in terms of making it believable, you want to get that kind of honesty and realism in there, but at the same time, you don't want to sort of overburden the reader with the kind of things that, I'll see on the day job. I mean, people will say to me, "Oh, you should write a book," not knowing that I do actually write books. But my standard line to that is nobody would believe it. Nobody would believe the sort of stuff that we see, either from the stupidity point of view, from the idiots that we deal with, and then to the really horrible stuff that we deal with. So you need to find a balance, basically, between bringing that into the books and leaving it out. I mean, some of the people in the Dark Peak series were based on, the serial killer in Cold was based on a real person she was just a thrill killer. She just liked going around murdering people for kicks. And that was where that came from. That was where she came from. It was a real person whose story I kind of pinched and manipulated for my own end. But yeah, I'll tone down sort of medical things as well, because you don't want to bamboozle the reader with too much detail that they then have to go and Google away.
Yeah, you don't want it to be a textbook, do you?
No, basically, no. And there's finding that balance between making your story real and getting enough detail in there to show that you know what you're talking about and that you have done the legwork and that you've put the hours in to get it right. But also, yeah, making it really, really dull to read or just too overwhelming for the person to try and pick their way through. So I'll throw medical terms in there, but they'll either be explained in the text or there'll be terms that will be familiar from maybe telly or other books or media in general. People are pretty au fait these days with a lot of medical terminology. But yeah, I'll try and explain as I go along, and if I can't explain it, then I'll take it out. I might write it, but then on a reread, it'll come out, or it'll get simplified, or it'll get altered or explained.
Nice. Cool. I'm going to turn to some of our reader questions or audience questions. Let's see. Do you find it hard to leave the world you've created when you start a new book? So is it hard to leave your last one behind? I leave mine, I'm like, see ya. You're done, I'm gone. Emma, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think it's strange because the one small step of the book that I haven't written a lot of books, I'm a newbie, but that book was set in London and it was interesting. So that's a well and a well. I lived there for 20 years and for me it was almost like a farewell to London. I don't live there anymore and I really miss the city. So for me there was something really nice about a world in which those characters were in London, visiting pubs and having curries and running up Hampstead Heath, and it was like a bit of a love story to London as well as a love story in its own sense. So in a way, it helped me say goodbye to London. Strangely, it was a really nice way of leaving London behind. So yeah, I think it's less relevant for me as a contemporary romance writer, perhaps, than if you're creating a world in the way that you would, or Barbara would, or whatever. But yeah, I get very attached to it, maybe because I'm still so new. I'm not so callous. I still pick up that book a lot and read it and stroke it and things like that.
Oh, very nice. Yeah. I am callous. Rebecca, how about you?
Is that the question? Are you callous? I don't find it difficult to leave the world behind in terms of finishing a book and being at the end of it. Funnily enough, I find it easier as a writer than I do as a reader. I hate reaching the end of books as a reader. I hate leaving the world behind there. As a writer, I think because you've always kind of seen the end and you, in a way you think beyond the end, it doesn't feel like it's fully closed. But I think because I write historical fiction, the world's always there in a sense. It's always existed. It's just that I've put my own story into it. And it's amazing when it comes flooding back. So I might just be, I don't know, visiting another museum or something. And all of a sudden there's something that's smack bang in the middle of the historical world that I wrote in. And my characters exist in that world just as much as all the historical fact does. So it's kind of always there to pop back and revisit. So it can be quite a jolt to start writing about different characters in a different world. But I don't ever feel like I've completely closed it off and left it behind at the same time.
Nice. How about you, Justine?
All of my fictional worlds are well imprinted, and they. I'm convinced that your brain cells record intense experiences, whether they're real or not. And certainly if you are reading a good book, imprints itself in your mind. Writing a book imprints itself in your mind. So I have really been to all of those places, and now I know all of those people. When I dream about them, I can close my eyes and go back to them. They're very real worlds for me, and I hope they are for some of my readers.
Yeah, awesome. Barbara?
Sorry, before you change, can you hear my neighbor's music? They're playing it quite loud.
We can, yeah.
What you do about it? They won't turn it off. Can you? As long as you can hear me, we have to put up with it.
We can hear you fine.
When the others are talking.
Yeah, we can hear you, no problem. So
okay.
I think when I write a standalone book, sometimes I'm like, I start thinking about all the different things I could do with this world, these people, these whatever, but I shelve those and start thinking about something else. So I can leave those behind. It's a little hard maybe, but I'm like, I can always go back, make some new notes. But my series, a lot of times by the time I get to the end, I'm like, I'm going to kill you all. Because I like making up new worlds, and it is a little daunting if you think about it from the very beginning. But at the end, you're like, a lot of people have asked me, why do so many people die in the final book of your series? And I'm like, if it was up to me, sometimes they all would. But so I think that's it for me. I can leave my worlds behind pretty easily when it's a series because I feel like I've finished something, I've done something, and I hate everyone. But for my standalones, sometimes it's a little harder.
Awesome. Thank you. I relate on every level there. Cari, how about you?
I've been told that I have attachment issues in the past. I've got better at it, though. I think I've got better at saying goodbye to characters. I mean, it was hard at the end of the Dark Peak books because I'd spent 3 years with those characters. And I wrote a sequel to Desolation Point as well with Alex and Sarah that I probably shouldn't have because that was deemed a romance that should have finished, in one book. But I went ahead and wrote a sequel to that. So I was quite bad at the time at saying goodbye to characters. The Dark Peak book, though, I think it closed out in the right place. So the series closed out properly. So I was kind of happy to move on from that. And I've got better at writing standalones and just going, right, that's it. I mean, some people have mentioned a sequel to Breathe, but I wouldn't go back to them and write another one. I don't feel that there's any need to, really. I would certainly write another sequel, another series in the future. Absolutely, would like to do that. And have that kind of, maybe 3 years with the same characters and the same world and the depth of relationships and character that you get from a series. And I've never really got to the point where I've wanted to kill everybody at the end of them either. So that's good.
Maybe that's the purview of the fantasy and sci-fi people. We just want to kill everybody.
I think of it as part of the process of writing.
And being human. Cari, this one's particular to you. What is it like being recommended by Richard and Judy?
Is the person actually being serious because it wasn't me?
I don't. Maybe they think it was you. I don't know. There's no sarcasm thing there.
To be fair, they've done me a great favour. They actually recommended an author called Cara Hunter, who is a British crime writer who writes mainstream crime and who I have been mixed up with ever since. And she has been great for my sales. She has sold more of the Dark Peak books than I probably sold when released. I've picked up a load of mainstream readers as a result of her because I can see on Goodreads when you go onto Goodreads, you click on the reader, it's just whatever 3, 4, 5 stars your book to see what the hell else they read, and they're all mainstream crime readers at the moment. So she's been very, very good for me. I have no kind of bones with Cara at all. She possibly should have Googled her name before she used it. because I'm guessing I come up in her. So the only thing that I have had is very straight men getting very angry at suddenly reading a crime book featuring lesbians. I've got somebody on Audible who was really, really pissed off that he'd read this book where a gay doctor and a gay police officer were just being gay, and nobody was bothered about it at all, and he was really, really offended by that. It was hilarious. It's one of my favorite reviews that I've got on Audible. But yeah, it wasn't me on Richard and Judy, but I have reaped the benefits ever since. So if Bolstrokes have been wondering why the hell the Dark Peak books have done so well recently, it's Cara, basically. I know every time she gets a new book out, because I get a little bump.
That's awesome. So we've got one that's particular to Justine and Rebecca. Do you need to research social mores, views, and fashion, etc., for your historical stories? And how do you go about doing that? So, Rebecca, do you want to jump in?
Yes, absolutely. Because you've got to know what would have been appropriate at the time. Whether you play with that or not is one thing, but you've got to know what the rules would have been, so the world that the characters lived in. That's partly about it being authentic, but it's also, if you are going to write historical and you are going to, for example, impose a lesbian relationship where there may not have been one, you've got to know how that would have been received, how people would have responded to things, and how that would have affected the characters themselves. And I actually love putting queer characters into the past. I think they were always there, but they're not recorded as always being there. So you've got to kind of weave those people into an authentic world and a real world. In terms of how you go about doing it, it varies. Actually, for me, reading literature written at the time is a really, and particularly in terms of how people interact with each other and how they feel about things. Particularly for my 1920s book, I read a lot of 1920s literature to get a real sense of that world. In terms of fashion and things like that, I go to Pinterest a lot of the time, actually, particularly if it's a slightly more contemporary time, because there's all kinds of images on there from the time. And I've been known to actually lift a dress that may now be from the 1920s and like in the V&A Museum in London and steal details of it. And it's not an exact description, but it's very nearly there. So yes, I think you have got to be you've got to have it in your head as the context, and then you can write your story into that and you can change things, but you've got to have it there in the first place.
Nice. Justine? Oh, you're muted, Justine. Sorry.
Noisy neighbors. As Rebecca points out, a historical author has to observe all of the details, the mores, the temperatures, the behavior, and for me also the clothing, which is why I always have a costume. Before I finished writing To Sleep with Reindeer, I made sure that I had a Sami jacket. Because I wanted to know what it felt like to wear it and how warm it was and whether it got dirty with reindeer poo. It does. But you also have to be careful of using expressions. You're writing, of course, in English, and you cannot use modernisms if you're writing about another culture and another period. You cannot say, for example, I'm like, which is what Americans say left, right, and center. It drives me nuts, but they do. You absolutely cannot use that because no one else ever did say that except a 20th century American. There's all kinds of phrases you can't use. You can't use a kind of stand-up comedy sarcasm that works nowadays. You have to observe every little tiny detail of that culture, and your good writers will notice if you get it wrong, and you'll hear about it.
You find yourself doing things like researching the first time a swear word was used to check that someone can actually use it and things like that. So it's fantastic.
And you cannot have someone else in a historical period or another culture say fuck, because they didn't.
That's a shame. It's a really useful word. Barbara, this one's for you. How do you deal with finite things like time and measurements in your books?
I would say I deal with them very, very grumpily, because it takes a long time for people to walk anywhere, And when you're talking about fantasy where that's before trains, before cars, and also if you deal with horses a lot of the times, if the people have access to them, then you've got to research how far can they walk in a day, how far can they run, how far can they go without getting tired. And so if I'm making up a creature that I want people to ride, I got to kind of think, well, is it like a horse? Is it more like something else? You know, what's the approximate distance this can go? How fast can a person walk? Can a normal person walk? If you were used to walking all the time, every day, how far can you walk in a day? And a lot of people have asked me before, you know, do you actually walk a lot to get things, or to know how long this takes? And I'm like, no, not absolutely at all. I'm not like Cari Hunter to go traipsing around the mountains to see how long it takes to get up them. No, I usually just sort of research all of this. If somebody is so tall and so fit in this age, how long does it take them to walk there? And then I get really depressed because walking takes a long time.
It's true. And when you're building worlds, do you ever slide your places a little bit closer together?
Oh, I have to, because otherwise it would be Lord of the Rings, where they're walking and they're walking and they're walking and they're walking. And it's like, it takes them months. Well, that's because they're going across an entire goddamn country. But I'm like, okay, well, I really want them. 2 days is my max. My writing group likes to laugh at me because everything is 2 days from everywhere. Because that's as much as I can freaking stand it. So yeah, I have to be like, okay, these places are actually quite close together because it only takes 2 days to get from here to there. And to me, that's like, oh, it's like Maine and Texas. It's just the farthest. No, it's really like Texas and a slightly further part of Texas.
I understand. My characters were walking, and I finally decided to give them a car that happened to have gasoline because I couldn't stand it anymore.
No, well, as people have asked me about traveling, and I'm like, if you're going to travel by car outside of Texas and you live somewhere in the middle, the first day is Texas. It doesn't matter where you're going. Your first day of travel is Texas. It's that big. And so people are like, oh, driving somewhere. When I was in the UK, I was like, we could go there. It's only 2 hours. And people were like, oh, God, that's like an overnight trip.
That's true.
That's not even out of Texas.
Yeah, that's very true. This one was directed to Justine, but I think it's good for everybody. How do you distinguish between fact and fiction when you're doing your research, particularly on the internet? I think most of you have said that you already start with a base. So if there are things that you're particularly researching, how do you know that they're correct? Rebecca, you mentioned Pinterest, and Pinterest just angers me because I find an image and I want to log on to it, and it's just a picture, and then it says you must subscribe. So how do you then kind of go on and find your true research?
That's fairly. I think I've got a fairly good instinct for it anyway, because I work in museums, because I've got a sort of academic mindset. I think in terms of distinguishing when somebody's just spouting something, like you come across blog posts where people have just theorized their own thing, and there's no historical context. You can tell for the most part, but it does have to be fact checking sometimes. If you have found a photo on Pinterest, does it look very similar to something that you've maybe found in a more academic article? Is there a book about it? So and sometimes it matters more than others. Sometimes, as long as it's about right, then actually you're creating a work of fiction, so that's all right. But not if it's going to be something that an entire sort of historical event hinges around.
Oh.
And so sometimes it's about sort of judging how much you need to know about something as well. And actually, I mean, if something's sort of universally popular, if everybody thinks something looked like that at that time, you can probably put it in a book and nobody's going to mind. So I think it's just using your judgment, and it's something that you hone as you go along. I'd never want to put anything in that was untrue or not authentic, but at the same time I'm willing to be creative, so I don't need kind of absolute academic proof like I would if I was putting it in a museum display case, so because it is ultimately fiction. So I think it's nuanced, I'd say.
How about you, Emma? when you look at it, how do you determine that it's actually true?
I think it's just looking, because it's maybe not so fact-based. I'm not looking for one sort of fact about a historical event or something like that. So I did a lot of reading around the music industry and how it closets pop stars and these sort of PR relationships that exist. And I had a notion of it from my own understanding of just reading online. But then when I started to look into it, you realise there's so much more to it. So I think it's just about layering, for me, the research, so you're not relying on one source or one blog post or one embittered person or whatever, and just trying lots of different sources. And if you can, because again, I mean, if you can talk to people, who, like, I'm not a mum. One of my characters is a mum of a small child. I think I have a notion about that, but clearly I don't, and I can research it, but I can talk to mums a lot, and that helps me to really get a feel for that character, what they go through, and even just basic things. What age kids go to kindergarten? Do they drink tea? I mean, literally, I rang one of my friends and said, like a 3-year-old, when I was 3, I drank tea. Do American 3-year-olds drink tea? They were like, no, not really. That was just a little thing. It's strange, but I think talking to people is super valuable. My stuff is contemporary, it's not historical. People are alive, so it helps. Cari talked to many of those Soviet women pilots and asked them how it was, so yeah.
We're just about out of time, so what I'd like you to do is tell us what your most recent book is that people can run over to the BSB website and grab right now. Barbara.
That would be Not Your Average Love Spell. I listened to Brey's instructions to bring the book to show it. It's a standalone fantasy romance, and people use the word fuck quite a lot.
Excellent. There's been a conversation going in the chat about the origins of the word fuck.
It was conversation in ancient Greek.
In Greek, yeah. Justine, your most recent book.
My most recent book is not out yet, which is a contradiction in terms, isn't it? My manuscript that's done will not be out until October. This is what it looks like, I think. No, it doesn't. Never mind. This is what it looks like.
It's a beautiful cover.
Yes, I love it. I love the Northern Lights and the combinations of blues and greens. So I would recommend, if you want to read a terrific book, to run out right away and buy Witch of Stalingrad. I'm very proud of it. And it's about female Soviet pilots. When you're finished with that, maybe in October you can buy To Sleep with Reindeer.
Fantastic. Thank you, Justine. Rebecca?
Fragile Wings. I bought a copy. It's set in the 1920s. It's about a girl from Devon who finds herself in London with the bright young things of the 1920s. And there's lots of drinking cocktails and dancing and things. It's fantastic.
Fantastic. Thank you. Ame?
Yeah, One Small Step. I also was obedient and brought a copy. Kind of very nice cover too, I think. So yeah, One Small Step is out. It's about Iris and Cam, American, a Brit, fall in love in London. Sweet. It's kind of sexy and a bit angsty. Slow burn, I think that's the word. Thank you.
Excellent. And Cari. That's Cari's cover, Brey. Because we seem to have lost Cari's voice altogether now. And it's a very good book, and it's got Cari Hunter kind of grit and excitement in it. How's that, Cari? Yeah, okay. Excellent. Thank you so much to our amazing panel. That was a lot of fun. And I can say all of you just write such beautiful things and lots of fun. So the next panel is at 1:30, so you've got a little bit of time to go grab some lunch and come back to us. And that is new and upcoming brand new releases from your favorite authors. So readings and talking about brand new books. And we will see you then. And thank you again for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get to them, but come back and ask them to the next panel. So, thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.